And we're back with our panel. David, I want to start on the tax cut question with you, which is often in Washington when we have these cultural moments, everybody gets boxed up and nothing gets done. The tax cut bill is moving lickety-split through Congress.
Right. Moving lickety-split through Congress that a lot of people have been down on for a long time for doing nothing, particularly on the right side of the aisle. Look, I'm optimistic something's going to get done here. There's enormous pressure from every wing of the GOP. The GOP civil war is kind of settled on this one point. There's a need for tax reform. So I do think something's going to happen. I do think what we're going to get, while it's not exactly going to be the Senate bill, it's not exactly going to be the House bill, is going to be something better than the status quo. What that's exactly going to be yet, we don't know.
Ruth, I know you care about budgets.
I do. Better than the status quo for who is one thing I might say. I think that the prognosis for this bill is really interesting. Every Republican lawmaker that I know is desperate to see something passed. But there are two problems here. One is that they are not desperate to, they don't all agree on what that something is. And so we've used the Rubik's Cube analogy before. This is like super Rubik's Cube. There are so many pieces that you can lose somebody on, and that Senate majority is very slim and the House majority is complicated because of the state and local tax deduction. And then I have the question, I understand they're desperate to pass it because they have done nothing else legislatively. They're going to just have to run on Bud Gorsuch, the Supreme Court nominee, whose vacancy was created beforehand. But if it
some stuff through with the Congressional Review Act.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I don't think that's the greatest messaging. But if they pass it, is that great news for Republicans? Maybe better than the alternative. But there's going to be a lot of Democratic messaging about hits to the middle class and favoring corporations with permanent tax cuts over the middle class, many of whom will be worse off at the end of this.
Do you think that's right, Susan? Democrats see an opportunity to rush in and say, wait, the middle class tax cuts expire for $14 million. This can't, do they have an opportunity on this?
Well, they do, since they could argue, for instance, that the Trump family alone could benefit to the tune of more than $1 billion if this particular tax bill passes. The Republicans have another problem, and that is the number 12. That is the number of full legislative days left from now to the end of the year, when they also need to fund the government, which runs out of money on December 8th. They need to deal with hurricane relief. So it will, in fact, be lickety-split, as you said, if they manage to get something by the White House deadline of Christmas to get a tax bill through. And if they manage to do that, it will be because they're so interested in passing something that they won't care about exactly what it is they're passing.
They have to get something out of the Senate at least by Christmas, because otherwise, if this Roy Moore thing doesn't turn out, the numbers in the Senate will change, and they'll lose one Republican senator, and that there are at least two, Ron Johnson and Lisa Murkowski on the Senate side, who have real issues with this tax bill. Is that real opposition, or is that the kind of opposition you get so that your thing can get fixed?
I'd actually tweak it and say Ron Johnson for sure. Based on some comments she made this morning, Susan Collins actually probably still has some legitimate concerns. Murkowski's point was just that we need to stabilize the markets. It's not contingent.
The health insurance markets.
Right. This bipartisan bill by Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray, her office clarified later Friday, despite some comments she'd made earlier in the day, isn't contingent on her support for the tax bill, but she's expressing a concern that certainly some of her Republican colleagues have. I would watch more the Republican senators who are concerned about things like the deficit. That is Bob Corker. That is Jeff Flake. That is probably Ron Johnson. And then, secondarily, whether or not this includes changes to the individual mandate. There you lose Susan Collins, maybe Lisa Murkowski. And if the thing is happening too lickety-split, you may lose John McCain, who has been arguing that this has to be done methodically and fairly to both sides. He says that last week's deliberations in the Senate went perfectly in that regard.
Can I jump in on the deficit? Quickly, I can't be contained. The whole agreement here.
Neither can the deficit.
Nice. Is 1 point, we're going to pass this, but we're going to be fiscally responsible because it's going to be only $1.5 trillion. The budget director made clear to you in his comments that that is not the intention at all. The intention is to eventually make these individual tax cuts permanent to the tune of closer to over $2.2 trillion. If you think that you're fiscally responsible so that you can only afford a $1.5 trillion tax cut, you should not vote for this because everybody is saying it's going to cost more than that.
David, Give me a sense of two things. One, what Ruth says and what happened to the fiscal hawks. But then secondly, you mentioned Steve Bannon and the people he supports and the kind of core of the Trump message.
Right.
How does this tax bill line up with them that corporations are going to go down to 20%? Do they care, or do they buy the argument from Trump?
Okay, I'm in the camp that believes that this Trump populism thing is not really a meaningful ideological movement in the Republican Party. Trumpism is the personal ambition of Donald Trump. That's Trumpism, okay? This populism has always been a relatively small slice of the GOP pie. We're not looking at a big political sea change here. And the people who make up Trump's base are far more concerned with the perception that Donald Trump is succeeding than they are with any given line item of the quote-unquote Trump agenda. So I think that the bottom line analysis here is, does Trump help get tax reform passed? If the answer is yes, MAGA. If the answer is no, then, well, you know, it's Mitch and Paul Ryan, it's not Donald Trump, that will ultimately receive the blame in Trump world. But I think that we've gotten down to a sort of a post-ideological age in some ways when it comes to the success of Donald Trump, where the most important thing is perceived by his fans as the success of Donald Trump.
MAGA standing, of course, for Make America Great Again, for anyone who doesn't know that. Susan Page, 16% in a Quinnipiac poll thought they were going to get a tax cut here. What David says about the Trump voter rings true from the Trump voters I've talked to. What about the rest of the country?
Well, I think this tax bill is a tough sell for the rest of the country, and especially because some of the arguments that proponents are making are so easily disproved. You know, for instance, the idea that repealing the estate tax is going to help farms and small businesses. This year, 80 farms and small businesses are affected by the estate tax. It's the estate tax benefits the wealthiest Americans, only 5,000 or so of whom get caught in the estate tax. So I think that the idea that the reality of the tax cut helps the rich at the expense, raising taxes over the long term for even families below 30,000 is something that creates big difficulties for Republicans.
All right, we got to go. We'll be back in a moment.